the Ivey Impact ESG event series. My name is Matthew Lynch with the Centre for Building Sustainable Value here at Ivey. I'll be your host and moderator for today's session. Ivey Impact Live events are intended for leaders like you to challenge perspectives, inspire new ideas, and ignite innovation. The focus of our event today is sustainability. And it's fair to say in the last 5 years, we've witnessed a major transformation in the strategic importance of sustainability in business and finance. There is a broad consensus among investors, business leaders, and policymakers that sustainability issues, including climate change, biodiversity loss, and growing social inequity, not only represent systemic risks to the economy and society overall, but are now material to firm valuation and investment decision-making. This materiality is driven by multiple considerations. The actual physical risks posed by things like water shortages or extreme weather events, top of mind as we enter another wildfire season here in Canada. And also the transition risks of being left behind as markets and policy shifts. But this is also an opportunity agenda, as the momentum towards a sustainable net zero economy opens enormous opportunities for new products, services, and business models across all sectors. ESG, environmental, social, and governance considerations, is a framework originally developed in the financial sector for systemically considering these non-financial factors that are relevant to investment decision-making. And it is perhaps indicative of the influence of investor perspectives that ESG has moved into wider usage as essentially synonymous with sustainability. ESG has clearly entered the mainstream. 50% of assets under management in Canada now incorporate ESG factors into the selection and management process. And we are seeing new sustainability disclosure standards and regulations internationally and here in Canada that are set to further drive this agenda. But in the last 18 months, the picture has become more complex. Alongside uncertain economic and political conditions, we are seeing backlash and critiques of ESG. In the US in particular, ESG, now labelled as woke capitalism by some, has become a flashpoint in politics and broader culture wars. By one count, there are 60 pieces of anti-ESG legislation being advanced in Republican states. Another critique is that many applications of ESG appear to be essentially greenwashing, an elaborate repackaging of the status quo that makes little difference in terms of changing firm performance and addressing the urgent challenges we face as a society. In our discussion today, we're going to lean into this conversation on ESG for business, both the driving developments and the controversies, to help leaders make sense of this agenda and chart a path forward. We want to thank the audience members that shared questions when they registered. These were very helpful in shaping today's discussion. Before we introduce our panel, we wanted to have a quick check-in with our audience. So we're going to now launch a poll, and we want to ask you, how is ESG currently considered at your organisation? You'll see the poll on the screen now. Is it central to strategy and decision-making? Important alongside other considerations? Mainly a measurement and reporting exercise? Not important, or I don't know. So if you please look at the poll and give a response. We'll give a few seconds for people to answer the question. So again, how is ESG currently being treated at your organisation? Okay, so here we're seeing some results, perhaps not surprising. Great to see in some senses central to strategy, but also I think where a lot of firms are is that category important, aligned, and alongside other considerations. And a few I don't know, so some curious people who will be learning more in today's discussion. So I now want to introduce our expert panel for our discussion today. We have Patricia Fletcher, who's the president of the Responsible Investment Association. The RIA is Canada's industry association for responsible investment. RIA members include asset managers, asset owners, and service providers who support responsible investment in Canada's retail and institutional markets. We have Roopa Davé, partner, ESG and Climate at KPMG Canada, one of Canada's leading accounting and advisory firms, and an Ivey alum. We also have Pyarali Jamal, also an Ivey alum, who's a UK-based ESG advisor, a member of the Sustainability Committee of the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales, and also part of our own Ivey Sustainability Advisory Council. We also have my colleague and friend, Diane-Laure Arjaliès, who's an Associate Professor of Sustainability and Accounting at Ivey and leader and founder of Ivey's Sustainable Finance Lab. So welcome all. So to start our conversation, we want to look at the current state of play on ESG in business and finance. So I'm going to start by asking Patricia, your members have been at the forefront of integrating ESG in investment decision-making in Canada. How would you sort of currently categorize the state of play of ESG in finance?
Well, I'd like to start by just thanking you, Matthew. Thank you for having me today. It's really a pleasure to be joining this session and our other panelists, and I appreciate the warm introduction. And again, for those of you who aren't familiar with the RIA, just to reiterate, our purpose is to promote the advancement of responsible investing by firmly entrenching RI in Canada's financial ecosystem. And to give a bit of context of the evolution of the organization and the magnitude, collectively, our members manage over 45 trillion of global assets under management. So there's a really strong movement and advocacy and support as we'll start to see, and I think as you see it over the conversation. With respect to the current state of responsible investing, what we're seeing from our RI trend surveys over the last 2 years is as sustainability issues increasingly define investment risk and opportunity, the financial sector is codifying RI practices, ramping up transparency and reporting, and pushing for much greater clarity and certainty. Canadian asset owners and managers are adapting more formal RI policies. They're anticipating consolidating reporting frameworks and increasing disclosure. And while investors are more confident than ever before in ESG reporting, and particularly their own, concerns about greenwashing, disclosure, and reliable data aren't easing at this point. In fact, they're still on the rise. We're also seeing the unintended consequences of some regulations being developed to address some of these issues, actually leading to a new concept called green hushing. And finally, to touch on a few of the things you kicked off in the original opening is, as the profile of this industry grows, there is a growing lack of understanding. We're finding a misrepresentation of facts and an increasing perpetuation of misinformation about what responsible investing is and what it is not. So for organizations like the RIA and proponents of responsible investing, advocacy for standards that inspire trust and confidence in RI, as well as industry education, are really huge priorities for us in this context.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Patricia, for that overview. I'd now like to go to Roopa. ESG in many respects, and one of the critiques of ESG actually is its breadth. How, from your sort of practice advising firms across sectors, how are firms targeting what's most critical or important in this agenda?
Thanks, Matthew. And I'd also like to say thank you for having me on the panel today, and my fellow panelists for the discussion we're about to have. So, I think it's a really important question that you ask, especially for businesses that are just getting started in this space. It can feel quite overwhelming. And there are a broad set of focus areas, but it's very important for businesses not to, boil the ocean, as we like to say, when you kind of approach the space of ESG or sustainability. I think you can start with the knowledge and that unequivocally climate has risen to the top of the ESG agenda. So, there's a small amount of focus on that. However, I would, on the flip side, encourage firms not to put on blinders and only focus on this. So a little bit of mixed messaging coming from me. I think ultimately it's very dependent on your industry and your business model. So companies will generally start with something we call a materiality assessment. Now, how you define a materiality assessment varies across geographies and different standards, from things called double materiality to single materiality. I think the focus really of our discussion today is really around sustainable investing and the investors. So really focusing in on that, what we call single materiality or financial materiality is quite important for businesses. And that can really help companies understand, like the goal is to really understand the significant topics that influence your business, or on which, of course, you can influence. And more importantly, from my perspective, the characteristics of those topics and how they relate to your business. Now, again, I'm talking a little theoretically here. A really kind of pragmatic approach for a lot of businesses is to look at the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or the SASB standards. They are a set of standards and KPIs and topics for different industries. They are by no means perfect. They were developed kind of with a US lens in mind. However, they're definitely very useful and a great start for different businesses to think about what might be the topics that impact my industry, and really a good launch pad to then consider different stakeholder views, particularly the investor, and what might be relevant for your business model. So I think leave the audience with you don't want to go too broad. A focused approach and understanding really how this translates to financial materiality is critical for businesses.
Wonderful. Thank you, Roopa, and a very useful top tip there on using SASB as that sort of high-level guide. Thank you. Now I'd like to move to Pyarali, and really looking to tap your wisdom. You're based in the UK, do a lot of work in the UK and European markets, and in many respects, possibly ahead of the curve of where we are in Canada. But I'd love to hear your views on where we are in terms of ESG and sustainability being integrated into wider business decision-making.
Yeah, great. Well, first of all, thank you and Ivey for having me on this panel and for organizing this webinar. It's an important topic and it's great to be involved. Yeah, we have started earlier and we have more bumps and bruises as a result of that. So it is very important, to look at these issues, but to really focus on metrics that matter and outcomes-based metrics. Whether it's for your strategic decision making, but increasingly your lenders, your investors, your customers, employees, and other key stakeholders are looking for and assessing ESG metrics, particularly around outcomes. And I'll use some examples to provide a little bit of color on that. So let's say, although it's increasingly common to see companies reporting their emissions on both absolute and on a carbon intensity basis, I don't see enough companies also providing information on how they compare to their peers and to industry average benchmarks. And it's also useful to see supporting qualitative information on how emissions data was collected and calculated. Again, keeping in mind that this is what people are looking for when they're trying to make useful decisions. And if they've used an internal carbon price, for example, how was it applied? What did they do with the funds that was raised? If they didn't use one, why didn't they? Realizing, by the way, that internal carbon price is probably more relevant to companies in certain sectors. And I'll continue with a few other examples. So if we look at ESG metrics around social issues, they're not particularly decision useful from the majority that I come across and that I work with. So for example, let's say reporting on the percentage of suppliers who have anti-bribery and corruption policy doesn't inform your key stakeholders or even your own organization how the company is actually managing those risks in its supply chain. But what is useful is, let's say you had information on the number of anti-bribery and corruption violations during the year. How many of them were substantiated as, let's say, being serious or presenting material financial risk? How many of those did the company actually implement corrective action plans for? And how many of those corrective action plans were successfully closed? This is the kind of detail that people are increasingly looking for, the so what question. If you have, let's say, a ESG sustainable focus fund, If you're investing in renewable energy companies, then the fund manager should report on, let's say, the amount of greenhouse gas emissions their investees have removed or prevented from going into the atmosphere. Or if you've made healthcare investments, then it's important to see how many additional patients, let's say, have received proper treatment from those investees. When I work with investors and with others, we look for this information, this decision useful outcomes metrics, and we don't quite see it. What you do see are how much capital is deployed, how many jobs were created, and so on. But a lot of those metrics are common to your traditional funds, right? And briefly, regarding governance factors, although we're seeing more ESG-linked remuneration for management teams, we're not seeing enough or adequate information on why they've selected those specific ESG metrics, or if they haven't used ESG metrics to link the remuneration, then why is that? And if I may add, finally, board assessments, independent board assessments are increasingly important. The UK Corporate Governance Code here recommends, for companies that fall within it, the larger companies, to do it every 3 years. Not all of them do, and in fact, I recommend that even small, mid-sized companies start to implement those sort of best practices. So these are some examples of actual issues that I'm working on with various organizations, and hopefully, they demonstrate the importance of decision-useful, outcomes-based ESG metrics and of their direct implications on risk management of value preservation and creation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Pyarali. I think I'll go now to Diane-Laure. Any sort of initial thoughts on observations on what you've heard so far?
Yeah, thank you. Bonjour à tous, merci. We're just joking about the fact I'm just coming from the Women in Asset Management program. So that's why I have my t-shirt, The Future is Female. And that's the first program in Canada that targets women who want to enter the investment industry. And I think this speaks to our positioning here at Ivey when it comes to the sustainable finance, is that of course, we want to cover the basics like standardization, SASB, disclosure, and we do gonna teach the basics, and we teach it in the mainstream classes, and we have a class in ESG in action as well. But we also want to be at the forefront of the topic, and so that's why we want to bring diversity and inclusion and create some space for women and the people of color. And the lab also, we focus on economic reconciliation and nature-based solutions. So somehow I agree with all the speakers. At the same time, you have to target the mainstream, the bulk of people who might not be in the same level where you are in the journey, and you have to bring this bulk of people. You have to be sure there's no greenwashing, there's standards, and everyone has a set of practices that are going to address the issues. But at the same time, us as a premier business school, and we train most of the financiers in Toronto, like a lot of our students go and work for the investment industry in Canada and in the US. We have to be sure we're ahead of the curve as well. Like we train them on topic that's going to be really important in the years to come. And clearly, we agree we have an impact assessment class. Pyarali, we talked about that. So we train them on impact assessment because we know outcomes is really important. And also in Canada, as an economic reconciliation, nature-based solutions, as we're transitioning from a fossil fuel-based industry to a regenerative type of industry, we have to get there. So I think this is what our speakers are talking to, is having different speeds at the same time, not losing anyone, but not losing the vision as well, and still going on and progressing.
Wonderful. Thank you. And keeping on that sort of future theme, we're now going to move into a discussion on some of the key developments that are sort of shaping the future of this agenda. Now, there's an enormous amount going on in this space, so it could be a discussion that could go for hours. But we're going to sort of focus on sort of two aspects in terms of enablers and critiques. The first element on the enablers side is the emergence of the voluntary disclosure standards. Now, one of the main things that I think has happened in the last few years in ESG is the establishment of the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is essentially sort of bringing together a global movement to produce standardized, comparable, decision-useful information for investors. And it's very topical in Canada because we now have the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board essentially producing local version of those standards. And that's a live conversation, given those standards are out for consultation as we speak. I'd like to maybe sort of direct a question first to Patricia. What's your sense of these new standards, both internationally and Canadian, and at the Canadian level? How are they going to sort of influence and guide investor decision making going forward?
Well, thank you. I mean, this is a really important development for investors. These hold significant importance for guiding decision making, particularly in the realm of responsible investing. With the development of these standards, we will finally have a structured framework for reporting sustainability-related information, which is endeavoring to ensure consistency, comparability, and transparency across companies and industries. And this has been a huge gap within this whole area. And the fantastic thing that has been done is that this has actually moved fairly rapidly, and it is adopting a lot of the great work that has already been done. So things like SASB that we've discussed earlier are being rolled into the ISSB, and even the CSSB is going to endeavor to stay as closely as it can to ISSB. And one of the really important reasons for that is to enable global alignment. So the ISSB, CSSB standards represent sort of this crucial step forward for global alignment in sustainable reporting, because they'll provide this common language, this set of metrics, and they'll enable investors to more accurately assess and compare the environmental, social, and governance performance of companies worldwide. Being able to confidently compare apples to apples across multiple jurisdictions is a huge, huge step forward. Risk management is essential, and there'll be a huge enabler of that. By standardizing the sustainability reporting helps investors better identify and mitigate ESG risks within their portfolios. And by having access, again, to consistent, reliable data, investors can make more informed decisions about the long-term viability and the resilience of their investments. And then one of the really important pieces is all around enhanced disclosure. You know, these standards are going to encourage companies to disclose more comprehensive and relevant sustainability information, including the metrics related to climate change, biodiversity, social impact, and corporate governance. So overall, this increased transparency is going to foster much greater accountability, ideally trust between companies and investors. So we really see these as being table stakes and the next step to drive meaningful change in the way investors assess and prioritize sustainability factors.
Wonderful. Thank you, Patricia. And just to flag, our next event in our series on June 4th is actually going to be a deep dive into these new international and Canadian standards, featuring a member of the International Sustainability Standards Board, Michael Jancy, CPA Canada's Lisa French, who's the VP responsible for managing that process, and our own Nadine Dagan. So going to be a really good discussion. So please sign up for that to sort of dig deeper into this particularly important agenda. I'd like to now move to Roopa, and it's not just developments in the voluntary sort of disclosure space that we're seeing, but we're also seeing a lot of movement on the regulatory side as well. One notable development that's catching a lot of attention is the things happening in Europe. The Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is going to drive significantly sort of robust reporting and will affect, by one measure, over 1,000 Canadian companies by the time it's sort of fully in implementation. We also have the SEC rules in the US on climate disclosure, and also developments here in Canada, the OSFI guidelines around climate risk for federally regulated financial institutions. There's obviously a lot going on. And so I'd really love to hear your view on, of this sort of growing sort of suite of developments. You know, what are the things that Canadian firms in particular need to be paying attention to?
Yeah, so you're right. There is a ton going on. You know, I actually often put up this slide in presentations I give of the globe and where there are either in place regulations or proposed regulations, and it's very quickly growing. So there's no questions asked. This is this is here to stay. It's being written into law and really quickly moving into kind of a compliance space. I think the question for Canadian companies is, again, sort of it depends. It's interesting, as I was hearing kind of Patricia talk about the concept of ISSB and this really great global baseline. I think what you've just spoken to is we've got kind of European standards, we've got a rule in the SEC, we've got ISSB. In Canada, we have the OSFI rules, and of course we have the Canadian Securities Administrators who have indicated that they'll be stepping into this space. So unfortunately, there is fragmentation. I think that's sort of the reality of what's happening right now, despite kind of best efforts from ISSB. So I think that can be quite overwhelming for firms. What I would say to kind of ease some of that concern is that they are all based kind of on a similar framework of the Task Force of Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or the TCFD. There's the 4 pillars of risk management strategy, metrics and targets, and governance, of course. So, all of these standards sort of are based on that. So that's something I'd say all Canadian companies should be paying attention to, is starting to understand that framework of kind of the 4 pillars and how you manage your sustainability topics. Of course, if you're a global company, your first step is, of course, to understand how different global requirements might apply, and come up with, essentially a plan or a comprehensive plan to adopt. But for Canadian companies, I think the best way to think about this is, there's no question the influence of the US market is sort of undeniable on Canada. So, the fact that the SEC has moved in this direction is a good indication that this is going to permeate throughout the economy. Most companies sit in the value chain of one of the businesses that's being pulled into, whether it be the European standards, whether it's our federally regulated financial institutions, or whether they're US-based companies. We're sitting somewhere in that value chain. We're either selling to, buying from, or taking lending or investment from a number of these firms. So, I think the view is that there will be a trickle-down effect on companies. And they can expect that they'll be asked for data and information, kind of, not in the immediate future, but probably in the near term. So really starting to get ready for what those questions might be, taking a look at, as I said, sort of the 4 pillars of the TCFD, and of course, more importantly, I think there's examples we were already hearing from a number of my clients that their banks have warned them that kind of in the near term, they'll be asking for their Scope 1 and their Scope 2 GHG emissions to support the bank's risk assessment of their financed emissions. So, I think as a Canadian company, we have particularly a private company, you have a bit more time, but it's imperative that this is coming, and there are steps you can do to get ready for kind of the shift in the economy with the movement towards regulated reporting.
Excellent. Thank you for that tour of a very complex landscape, Roopa. We have a question come through on the chat that I might just direct back to you because it's kind of relevant. Basically, the gist of the question is that the US uses different accounting principles in general. And the question, I think, is saying, is the US going to go its own in terms of the development of these standards? What's your thinking on that?
Yeah, and I think we've seen that they have decided to go their own route, while the ISSB definitely has a presence in the US, and there's a lot of support from firms and businesses in the US for the ISSB. The SEC has come out with their own climate rules, so they've issued 2 separate climate rules. As I said, they have echoes of ISSB or the TCFD, that similarities, but absolutely some stark differences, particularly around some of the financial information that they're asking for, and actual disclosures into financial statement notes. So yes, I think the US has decided to sort of chart their own path on this, and important for, if you are listed in the US, to understand that. Without getting too technical here, most Canadian companies are multi-jurisdictional filers, so they are not required to adopt the US climate rules. But of course, it's still really important to understand what your peers or other companies in the US are reporting to.
Yeah, excellent, great. So we'll perhaps sort of stay a bit perhaps in the US context as we sort of look now at some of the critiques around the ESG agenda. And we're going to start with perhaps a sort of more fundamental, sort of tricky question. And I'm going to direct this to Diane-Laure because she's good at answering these. So, this sort of critique of this being just woke capitalism, is that just sort of political ideological posturing? Or is there something that we should be paying attention to with those in the sort of sustainability field? Is there something there we need to be paying attention to?
Yes, of course. When there's a strong critique, you have to pay attention to what's going on. And this is a really strong critique, and it's quite unique in history, like it's recently happening. And I think fundamentally what we're looking at is a moment of transition. So when the financial markets were developed, the modern form of financial markets, 60s, 70s, Chicago School of Economics, portfolio management, okay? This was a moment where capitalism was bringing success and social progress to the middle class American, like there was no question capitalism was something good. And at the time, there was no question, there was no inclusion of explicit social and environmental concerns, there was something that's perceived as outside the investment decision. But this was an ideological decision as well, to put it outside this investment decision. And it was done like this because, again, this was perceived as benefiting the Americans as they were progressing into the social ladder. Like, today is a completely different moment in history. So first, we know there's more social inequalities. We know that the revenues of capital is higher than the revenue of labors. And we know that the middle class American, because anti-ESG movement is really into the US, but of course we're impacted in Canada, is not progressing, is not as wealthy as the previous generations. And at the top of it, you had climate conversation. So as the capitalistic system, the issues are evolving, those questions start entering the investment decision. Is it more ideological than the previous conversation? No, it's not more ideological. It's just like reflecting a different perspective on what is happening now and how you have to pay attention to these concerns as you want to make investment decisions and benefit the citizens. But what happened with the anti-ESG movement is that people who benefited from the previous model and mostly fossil fuel driven globalization made shareholder value focus, they're not really happy with this move, And so for them, this is really difficult to accept, and they will see that as an ideology that goes against the benefits. And so what we're looking at right now for me is a moment of transition. And there are important questions we need to address. I think it could be a benefit to the movement of sustainable finance, because I think it raises questions about what is the goal of it. Like, what do we want to achieve? Is it just about financial performance, or is it about putting the capital allocation and distribution towards the transition we want to achieve? And that's a big question, I think, that it forces people to address. So I see some good benefits into this movement too.
Yeah, excellent, great. Actually, that's a good segue. Pyarali, I'm going to go to you now. What's your view on this as we see sort of backlash? Is this going to sort of delay and reduce the impact of this agenda, or is this something that perhaps, as Diane-Laure has suggested, sort of will ultimately improve and enhance this as a model going forward?
Yeah, I think the net effect is quite positive. Okay, and there are 4 points I'd like to make around this. The first is, backlash, whether it's warranted or not, often helps. It helps to focus attention on questionable business practices, and also on how to improve regulations and standards to make them more fit for purpose. So, for example, in the UK, we also now have the Competitions and Markets Authority Green Claims Code and the new Sustainability Disclosure Requirement Anti-Greenwashing Rule. And combined, they're going to help improve transparency, consistency, accountability. So businesses and directors may face serious financial fines and penalties if they violate. So this will help reduce greenwashing. And I believe Canada's Competition Bureau wants to try to gain similar powers. Second thing I want to point out is that, those who are asked to provide independent verification and assurance services like around ESG practices and factors, they themselves are still learning. Many have difficulty distinguishing between output and outcome measures, and the vast majority are still not quite, familiar with or trained in the theory of change framework, which is essential for assessing ESG factors, particularly the non-quantitative, the non-financial ones. So this is indirectly, unintentionally contributing to some of the greenwashing we're seeing. I'm involved in developing and delivering some of the new training in this space, both in the UK and in Canada. So I see this firsthand. And the same is true actually for asset managers, right? They're still learning how to integrate ESG factors into their investment processes and reporting. And in the UK and Europe, as you know, we're further ahead with SFDR and the EU taxonomy, and they're still struggling with that, right? So all that, however, will improve with experience through the normal maturation process. Third, it's important, I think it's particularly important, to keep in mind the difference between ESG backlash in the US, which is where a lot of it comes from, not only, but a lot of it, compared to, generally speaking, the broader support for sustainability and wider ESG adoption in Europe. There's more political polarization in the US than in Europe, as we know. There's also more regulatory uncertainty in the US than in the UK and Europe. For example, the SEC's new climate rules, which were watered down after a lengthy consultation process, are now challenged and delayed in the courts. There's also more institutional investor skepticism in the US than in Europe. One survey last year revealed that over 70% of European pension fund managers, pension scheme managers, said climate change was an investment priority for them, compared to about 50% of US pension fund schemes. And I think quite tellingly, according to Morningstar, in Q1 of this year, Europe accounted for about 84% of global investments made in sustainable funds, compared to just 11% made in the US. And so whilst US sustainable funds have seen an outflow over the last 2 quarters, ESG and sustainable funds in Europe have actually seen a noticeable inflow. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, Q1 of this year was more than double the inflow in Europe compared to Q4 of last year, according to Morningstar. And last, I think we need to pay attention to this one, which is that in early next year, all countries which have signed up to the Paris Agreement will have to, or not have to, but will be asked to submit their updated nationally determined commitments, or NDCs. There's a strong expectation that most countries, including Canada and the UK, will include more detailed information on their transition financing requirements and plans. Many countries, including Canada and the UK, have legally committed through legislation to achieving net zero by 2050. And just on that point, earlier this month, the UK High Court ruled for the second time in 2 years that the UK government would have to redraft its net zero strategy because its existing plan doesn't provide enough detail on how it will meet its targets. And we know that in Canada, about $125 billion a year is required until 2050 to transition the Canadian economy to net zero. And that figure globally is, ranges between 4 and 6 trillion a year. That's already creating opportunities for Canadian investors, both domestically and globally. And that's only going to increase in the coming years, regardless of the current greenwashing backlash. So in summary, I believe we have to look at the wider issues along with global trends and opportunities, and not get too discouraged by the current ESG backlash, but we do have to pay attention to them and address them.
Wonderful, thank you, Pyarali. Let's keep going on the theme of greenwashing. Patricia has already mentioned the Responsible Investment Trends report that RIA produce, and it's, I think, fabulous reading for anyone interested in this agenda in Canada. And one of the interesting questions that's asked there is that you survey your members on what is the thing that's holding back the growth of responsible investment. And I think in the last couple of reports, at least, the top sort of factor has been sort of fear of greenwashing, concerns around greenwashing. I was wondering from your perspective, what can the financial sector, the investor members that you have, what can they do to sort of move away from these concerns around ESG as an elaborate form of greenwashing?
Great. Thank you, Matthew. I might also point out that the counterpoint to that survey question, so what is the biggest inhibitor to growth, is greenwashing. What is going to be the greatest driver of growth? Stronger regulation and standards. So there's a real sort of coupling of the two of where we are. And it really speaks to a little, very much of what Pyarali and Roopa were saying. The responsible investment industry is in the midst of rapid evolution. Within a very, very short period of time, it's gone from niche and novel to mainstream maturity. And there's an incredible sort of increase in complexity and sophistication within this space. And what we saw, certainly from the investment industry perspective, a rush into RI claims, sort of tempered very quickly by forces both external and internal to the financial industry. You know, highly publicized greenwashing investigations have certainly signaled that reputational and legal risk over overstating claims is something to be concerned with. And this has resulted within, you know, institutions bolstering the breadth and depth of their RI teams and bringing a much more critical lens to their investments and their own disclosures. And I think, again, as we've discussed with the development of standards like the ISSB, greater clarity on definitions that are being created by new taxonomies, movements towards not just voluntary disclosures, but mandatory disclosures. The future of the whole industry is really being written right now as we speak. And I think, you know, what we know is that RI in its many forms is now firmly entrenched. And what we need to move towards is informing public expectations and demands to combat greenwashing is greater clarity around the diversity of RI strategies and their intentions and their impacts, because they do vary. And there's a lot of conflating in those that either want to take a very reductionist approach to the industry or create messages that serve their purpose. But I think ultimately earning public confidence, support, and demand for impactful RI approaches is going to require a much more informed public conversation, just as this industry matures and the tools for it develop.
Yes. Yeah. Some very valuable insights there. Thank you, Patricia. Roopa, I know in our sort of discussion, sort of preparing for today, you mentioned that, you know, greenwashing is something that's top of mind with some of the work that you're doing with your clients. So I'd be interested to hear some more about that. And perhaps sort of linking back to Pyarali's point earlier around the sort of growth of the sort of assurance around ESG sort of reporting and claims and the role that has. And obviously at KPMG, that's sort of a key part of some of the services you offer to your clients.
Yeah, absolutely. I think kind of both Pyarali and Patricia have sort of spoken to what I'm seeing in the market, and particularly with a lot of our clients. I think understanding that we're moving from a pretty unsophisticated, space or nascent space of disclosure, I would use, or transparency around performance in ESG to expectations that are almost akin to financial reporting, which has been around for decades. You can imagine there's going to be some challenges as we kind of move towards that. So what I'm really seeing with companies, so corporates who are looking for that investment capital, is this almost culture shift internally from this space of voluntary reporting, which had kind of minimal governance, minimal oversight, minimal controls, really focused on kind of communications and marketing of ESG performance, and very much having kind of a broad stakeholder focus. So, nice shiny reports. I think that's sort of been the historic way, and that's not a fault. That is just the way that space kind of grew. As we shift very quickly to this space of compliance reporting, you can imagine it's a big shift. Your information needs to be complete and accurate. Claims need to be supportable. So this requires formal oversight. This requires development of controls. The information also needs to be decision useful and as we've been speaking on, focused on providers of capital. So you've got a really different operating model to deliver on compliance reporting versus maybe how firms have been approaching this historically. And so, really pulling on the experience of departments like finance, like legal, like internal audit, or to the extent possible, external assurance providers. Now, Pyarali mentioned the external assurance providers, which of course KPMG is one. They're still in learning modes, absolutely, no questions asked. I think the assurance standards are evolving just as quickly as the reporting standards. So it's not perfect, but I think if we're understanding that there is some credibility to a second set of eyes, again, whether that's your internal audit or an external assurer, particularly around kind of claims data, it can really kind of help elevate and move this culture shift along with all the other things that an operating model needs, such as training, technology, and all the other sort of aspects of it. So, I think the umbrella of greenwashing in a way isn't necessarily an entirely bad thing. I think it's moving that shift along as needed in order to get that information out to the market for it to be decision useful. So the culture shift is really what I'm seeing in response to those greenwashing claims.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. We have a question in the chat that I thought might be a useful one to sort of tie up some of the things that we've just been talking about. And the essence of the question is, we can say that ESG in principle is a good thing, but if you're a smaller firm with very limited sort of capabilities and resources, how do we get the balance right between disclosing and managing these issues and those limitations that especially smaller firms face? How do we manage that dilemma? Yeah, I'll sort of open that to the panel if anyone wants to jump in on that question. Oh, Patricia, yeah.
I'm going to set up Roopa really beautifully for this, but I think, it comes down to materiality. And that would be where you would start for a small organization. When you hear all of this in so many ways, the initial piece is where do we look? And I think if organizations really try and assess what if this is actually material to the value of my business, let's start with that. And I think one of the important things and you'll certainly hear from Michael Jancy and others, is don't let perfection be the enemy of progress. So it's taking those first initial steps. And the first initial step for any small organization is to say, do I have any material risks across any of these sectors or any of these issues that I need to be taking into consideration? And it's by taking those steps, you start to feed into the next steps and evolve as you go. But I think that we have done a fantastic job as an industry in many ways of overwhelming organizations. There's so many acronyms, so much new verbiage, and this is all so new that I think it inspires a fear at the beginning. And we recognize in Canada, even as an industry or as a country, we are dominated by small to medium enterprises, and that it's taking a measured step. So I think, Roopa, I'm just that's where you started. And I know when we start, you just say, does this even matter to me? There may be a number of organizations where this is not even a material risk, and understanding from that perspective. So I'd invite anyone else to weigh in, but.
Well, maybe sorry, Roopa, please go ahead.
Yeah, I can just jump in on, I think there's a real acknowledgement of the Canadian economy being very much that sort of small, medium-sized enterprise. And so I think, I don't want to speak on behalf of the Canadian Securities Administrators, but I think there's an understanding that would be taken into account in anything that does get kind of regulated. And I know you've got a session on the CSSB, but that was also one of the main abilities that they kind of worked into the standards as well, was additional time for adoption of more complicated aspects such as scope 3 or other aspects of the standard. So really building in time for businesses to come up the curve on this. And I think there is an understanding that it can be a lot. I think the only other thing I would add is, know why you're doing this. If this is really a compliance exercise, then treat it as that. You can be quite efficient in your treatment of that, and it can be quite different, of course, than if you're really treating it as strategic and long-term value creation. But there is that option, right? Is what are your ambitions around this, and what are you looking to achieve?
Yeah, no, that's great. And maybe segueing to our sort of the final section of our discussion, continuing on that theme, as we sort of navigate all this complexity, that we often hear that is where business needs to focus on how this agenda builds value. And I'd be interested, Roopa, maybe continuing on that line, what are the sort of key things that business need to take into consideration to sort of see ESG as value creation?
Yeah, and I think, for the risk of repeating myself and now repeating Patricia, I think the most important thing is to focus on the information that matters to your stakeholders. So what are those most material issues or topics to your business, and that align really to your enterprise strategy? So not going off in one direction with the sustainability strategy and thinking about corporate strategy completely separately. The alignment of those are critical. One of the things that's been really valuable, I think, working on materiality from a European perspective, is they've really sort of pushed this concept of impacts, risks, and opportunities. But I think that can be incredibly, it helps nuance the conversation. So when you're talking about climate change for a business, really understanding, is climate change a risk for you? Is it an opportunity for you? Is it a bit of a mix for you as a business? And then that actually really helps you get very clear on why you're focusing on the topic, and what the right responses should be. So what are your strategic responses? When you understand it's actually an opportunity for your business, that very much pivots how you think about it, and your focus isn't entirely, of course, you've got to mitigate, but that isn't your entire focus. So really getting those nuances on why this matters. Is this an opportunity? Is this a risk? Or is this really just an impact you're managing? And so that's, I think the first thing I would mention on long-term value creation. The second one is, we've talked a lot about regulated disclosure and reporting. So, what I'm working with or advising a lot of my clients on right now is, you now have the compliance lever to get the internal business case and budget to focus on this. Like, a lot of businesses struggle to get the business case and struggle to get the budget to focus on this. So you now have this regulated requirement. It's not a nice to have, it's a must have. So use that as an opportunity to look at how you're actually operating on particularly the disclosure front. Think about whether you can free up, if you've got folks in your organization who focus on ESG or climate or biodiversity or DEI, how can you free up your subject matter experts from the daily grind of collecting data through manual spreadsheets, and rework your operating model, pull in technology, pull in finance, pull in the folks who this is what they do every day to help free up your subject matter experts to actually drive the agenda and move forward. So I think there's actually an opportunity to really relook at how this work is being done internally, and finding an operating model that allows you to work on the value creation agenda.
Wonderful. Thank you, Roopa. Maybe going to Pyarali, how are you seeing this in terms of maybe building on Roopa's response there on how you're sort of guiding your sort of clients on how they manage this agenda going forward?
Yeah, and a lot of my work is with SMEs. So yeah, materiality really important. But part of that is consult with internal and external stakeholders. That's an important part. I'm sure that Patricia and Roopa would concur with that. And rely on, don't just look at the regulations, as has been mentioned before. Rely on the other frameworks that are out there. They will guide you. Doesn't matter what size you are in terms of your company. TCFD, the GFANZ recommendations, the UN guiding principles on human rights. It's about a just transition. Climate change is one issue, but you don't want to do harm on other areas of your business and to society, right? So that's important. Strengthening capabilities is another really important issue. Now, that may sound obvious, but I see a lot of organizations struggling with that, usually because they haven't put it as a strategic imperative. It's more of a tick box exercise, a compliance issue. You've got to build the right team to deal with these issues, and it's got to be integrated. And as part of that as has been mentioned, invest in systems and internal controls. The data gathering is important, and it's a challenging, understandably so, a challenging issue. So be prepared to adapt over time. I do think what's really important is over time, tie employees' remuneration in some way, in a limited way, to the organization achieving its key overall sustainability targets, not just for the senior management team. And I do see this happening more and more here. We are 12, 24 months ahead, so perhaps it's normal for it to happen here. But when you link a limited number of relevant ESG metrics to individual performance throughout the organization, it really focuses minds on both financial and non-financial results, which combined have a direct impact on risk management and value creation, and it really does incentivize behaviors. I'm mindful of the time, so just a couple other points. One is really important to report, not over-report. I see too many unnecessarily large sustainability reports or sections in annual reports that have just everything thrown in it. That's not helpful. Focus on metrics that matter, focus on outcomes-based metrics. If you're not familiar with outcomes-based metrics, people think they generally are, but a lot of people still struggle with it. Get your head around it, that's very important. And the other thing is that, look, things don't always work out the way you plan. You might get some negative publicity or things, your results aren't quite what you expect. Don't gloss over reality. Hold your hand up, hold yourself accountable. You will gain more credibility to do that. So in summary, I think what's important is to embed this way of sustainability thinking throughout the organization to really promote, as has been said, a culture of shared responsibility and collaboration. And that's necessary to affect positive change through transformation. And most organizations have to go through a transformation process to actually achieve their sustainability objectives.
Wonderful. Thank you, Pyarali. Patricia, a sort of final comment. We've talked about how your membership has sort of been at the front line of sort of driving this agenda in Canada. And I'm wondering, how can that leadership continue in terms of actually using the ESG agenda to drive the transition in the economy around sustainability and climate and the key sort of challenges we face as a society?
Thank you. I mean, investors have a really a number of strong tools to help impact the real economy. Certainly one of the big ones is engagement and advocacy. Investors can engage with companies to encourage greater transparency, accountability, and action around ESG. Initiatives such as Climate Engagement Canada, which brings together 45 institutional investors who are engaging with the top 40 emitters on the TSX, are just an example of how you can facilitate dialogue between investors and companies to advocate for stronger climate-related disclosures, emission reduction targets, and risk management. So there's that whole shareholder piece. Capital allocation is huge. One of the big opportunities we have here, and particularly for the financial industry, is the advocacy for the adoption of the Green and Transition Taxonomy, which is designed to help guide investors towards investments that support the transition of a low carbon and sustainable economy. It aims to provide clarity on what activities are considered environmentally sustainable and support a transition. And that's a huge piece that could really help mobilize capital towards what we need to do. And then always important for investors is impact investing. Canadian investors can actively seek out impact investing opportunities that can generate positive social and environmental outcomes along financial returns. And this could involve investments in things like affordable housing, community development projects, sustainable agriculture, clean tech initiatives. And I think so, just to quickly sort of name off three, I think that the influence and the expertise and resources of the Canadian investment community can really play a crucial role in driving real impacts and sustainability.
Wonderful. Thank you, Patricia. I'm actually going to give the last word to Diane-Laure. Obviously, business schools are not sort of impartial on the side of these conversations. And we need to play a role. And you've touched on some of the things that we do at Ivey, but what do you think more broadly the role of a business school in supporting this transition? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think there's three roles. First and foremost, we want to educate the next generations through our undergraduate and graduate programs, but also the current generation. Now, that's why we have this webinar, to educate our audience and Ivey alum, and everyone was interested. And we're also launching new online graduate diploma this year on finance for climate. So I really invite people who are listening to us, if they want to know more, there are some continuous education you can look at. The second thing is researching with community and industry partners the practices of tomorrow. We need to reinvent the way we do businesses. We need to test new things. And this is why we have 4 living labs here and the Center for Building Sustainable Value. Sustainable Finance Lab is one of those labs. We're creating new type of financial product, financial metrics, and we're testing them live, and we're learning from that. And so that's something we can do as researchers and bring this. And the last thing is, because academic publications take quite a lot of time to get published, we also publish policy brief, community engagement, industry engagement, like webinars. And so we want to be sure that we're impacting practice as we do a research, and we're not waiting for like 5 to 10 years to get the academic publications. All those have to be really based in evidence and form. So these are the 3 ways we can trigger change. And thank you so much for listening to us. I think this is one of the ways we try to achieve so.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Diane-Laure. I'd like to thank everyone. We did go a little bit over time, so I appreciate our audience sort of staying with us. I want to thank our wonderful panelists, some incredible insights and very valuable wisdom as we sort of navigate this complex environment. The last thing I want to mention, join us again on June 4th, the discussion we're going to have on the new voluntary standards, both internationally and in Canada, an important continuation in many ways of the discussion we've had today. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the day.